Good morning, good afternoon, or good night, and welcome to Command Power, the show in which we discuss all things Magic the Gathering with a focus on Commander. And today we have a brand new deck tech for you from the new set Phyrexia All Will Be One. And just a quick heads up, this is not a budget deck tech, so there are going to be some expensive cards in there, although I think it shouldn't be too hard to find substitutions for those expensive cards. But before we do that, just a quick reminder to please click subscribe if you enjoy these videos. It's the only way the YouTube algorithm really notices me, and we're currently growing the channel, and it helps me a lot. Much appreciated. And today we're going to be talking about Willowdusk Essence Seer. Now this is a commander that I've been very interested in for a while, and if you don't know what Willowdusk does, for 1 colorless, 1 black and 1 green, it's a legendary creature, Dryad Druid, 3/3 with 1 tap, choose another target creature, put a number of +1/+1 counters on it equal to the amount of life you gained this turn or the amount of life you lost this turn, whichever is greater. Activate only as a sorcery. So this is going to ask us to build a pretty unique deck that is focused on both gaining life and losing life. Usually we're going to choose one of those, but there's not that many decks that want to be doing both. However, as it turns out, it's a lot easier to control the amount of life we lose than the amount of life we gain, because there's a lot of effects that want us to pay life. So we're building our deck a little bit more around that, but there's a good way to recoup all that life, and that is by playing lifelink creatures that we can then load up with the counters from Willowdusk. So that's our main game plan. We're going to be playing a few lifelinking creatures that we can put counters on. The fact that you can only do it as a sorcery does limit it a little bit, because it means that you can get blown out by removal. So we have a couple of ways to protect Willowdusk in the deck, but in general I think this deck has received a lot of support in the last few sets and should be pretty fun to play, so I'm going to give it a whirl tomorrow and hopefully it goes well. Anyway, without further ado, we're starting off with Accomplished Alchemist. This is going to be really good, of course, in any deck that's gaining a bunch of life, and in this deck we are very interested in gaining life, so we can have some pretty silly turns mid-game where we have a huge life-linking creature that connects with our opponent, and then we can suddenly make a bunch of mana with this. Beledros with the Bloom is an all-star even in a normal deck, but in a deck that's built around losing life, it becomes even better. And not only that, it's also going to provide us little bodies that can save us life, because we're probably going to be pretty low quite a lot with this deck, and that can also gain us life when they die, so it just synergizes very well with this deck. Blood Tracker is one of the best cards in the deck because we can pay life to put counters on it, which is something that we're interested in, but we can also just put all the counters from Willowdusk onto it, and it doesn't trigger on dying, it triggers on leaving the battlefield, so there's very little that our opponents can do to stop us eventually drawing a ton of cards with this. Blossoming Bog Beast is one of our finishers of choice, so it's going to gain us a little bit of life, and then it's going to give a huge overrun effect to all of our creatures, and it counts all the life we've gained previously that turn, so it can be an absolutely huge boost. It does need to attack, and it's a 3/3 without haste though, so we do have to make sure that it lives. Cavalier of Night is here for a couple of reasons, mostly because it has lifelink, so it's a great creature to carry a bunch of counters, but then we can still use the other abilities. We're running a bunch of mana dogs that we don't mind sacrificing to destroy something of our opponents, and then when it dies, it's just going to bring something straight back to the battlefield, which is pretty good. Corpsejack Menace is going to double all of our counters, which, as you can imagine, is going to be pretty good with Willowdusk. Creeping Bloodsucker is a really good new addition from Jumpstart 2022, and I would pick this up if you haven't yet, because it's only going to get more and more expensive. This card's pretty good in a lot of decks, and in this deck it's going to drain our opponents for 3 and gain us 3 life at the beginning of our upkeep, so that's already 3 extra life that is going to add 3 counters with Willowdusk, which is very solid. Dark Confidant is an excellent magic card, and it's particularly good in this deck where we want to be losing a bunch of life. Defiler of Flesh is going to allow us to pay life, which is really good, and then it's also going to give evasion to our big creatures, which is nice as well. Dina Soul Steeper is obviously going to be very good in a deck like this because we're going to be getting so much life. Elves of Deep Shadow is the best mana dork in the deck simply because it deals 1 damage to us whenever we use it. Elvish Mystic is another good one to get our commander on turn 2. Erebos, God of the Dead, is going to allow us to pay 2 life and 2 mana to draw cards. That can be very good in the mid game where we're making a lot of mana. Ezreal Chandler is a really interesting card in this deck where we're gaining this much life, so it's going to make all of our creature spells cheaper, and we have a lot of creatures in the deck. That's pretty solid. It's kind of like a weird late game mana dork that can allow for some seriously strong turns in the late game. Bindhorn Elves is just another way to get our commander out on turn 2. Gala Greeters I really like in almost every green deck. I have an unhealthy obsession with this card, to be honest, but in this deck in particular it synergizes pretty well because it does a lot of things that we want to be doing. It's going to give us treasures, which are going to allow us to ramp, and then it's going to gain us life, which obviously we want as well. And the +1/+1 counters even have a little bit of synergy in this deck, so overall it just fits very well. Gifted Aetherborn is a really good turn to play as a death-touching, life-linking monster that can get counters put on it. Gix Yawgmoth Praetor I really like in most decks, but in this deck, again, it fits even better because we have so many small creatures that are going to have pretty decent stats thanks to the counters they're getting from Willowdusk. We should be able to connect a lot with this fairly easily, and at that point we're drawing cards and losing life, which is stuff that we want to be doing. It's also going to discourage our opponents from attacking us, which is nice because we're probably going to be taking a lot of self-inflicted damage. Giant Sage is going to add absolutely crazy amounts of mana in this deck. With even just one Willowdusk activation on it, it can probably get 4 or 5 counters, at which point it's tapping for 5 mana every turn. Crick, Son of Yawgmoth, costs us 6 life to pay initially, which is fantastic in this deck. It also has lifelink, which is something that we're definitely interested in, and we can just put counters on it. And it's also going to get counters naturally, so it just works really well. It's also going to make all of our black cards basically cost for Phyrexian mana, which means that we can pay life for them, which we're obviously interested in. Keen Duelist is another of my favorite cards, which fits perfectly in the deck. It's going to allow us to draw extra cards, and it's going to cost us life to do so. Llanowar Elves is another mana dork that can get our commander out on turn 2. Marshland Bloodcaster is interesting because it can allow us to play a ton of life in one go and play a spell for very cheap. Nighthawk Scavenger is a decent creature on its own, but when you add in our commander Willowdusk, it makes it so much stronger because it has evasion and it can be really big. Sapling of Kolfanor is a slow card, but it's a pretty good one. It's going to draw us extra cards and gain us life and lose us life. That's pretty much all we can ask for this kind of deck. It also happens to have indestructible, so you can slap on one of our equipments that give it lifelink and put counters on it. It might be very difficult for your opponents to deal with. Scavenging Ooze is a bit of graveyard hate that also gains us life, incidentally. Spike Feeder synergizes very well with Willowdusk because we can just dump a bunch of counters on it, which we can then remove to gain life, and then we can tap Willowdusk the next turn to put even more counters on stuff, so it's just going to be fantastic. Sproutback Trudge, we can cast from our graveyard as long as we've gained life this turn, and it's going to cost less, equal to the amount of life we've gained as well, so this should be a very good recursive threat if the game goes long. Otherwise, it can be a cheap trampler that can carry counters pretty nicely. Underrealm Lich is here for a couple of reasons. First, it's going to give us some nice card selection, which is always good. We don't have much graveyard synergy, but we have a little bit, so it can be useful there too. But mostly it's there because we can repeatedly pay for life as many times as we want, really, and make it indestructible until end of turn. That means it's going to be very difficult to remove this, and it's also going to synergize very well with Willowdusk. Vampire Nighthawk is another very decent lifelinking creature. Volscourge is one that I really like in this deck because it's only going to cost 1 mana to bring down, and yet it has lifelink, and it's also costing you life, so it can be really good with Willowdusk on turn 3 or 4 to just drop this and immediately put some counters on it for very cheap. Vanewitch Coven is an excellent card in a deck that's gaining a bunch of life. It also happens to have Menace, which means that it can carry counters fairly well. Village Broker of Blood is going to draw us an absolute ton of cards in this deck. It's also going to mean that your opponents can't really attack you while this is alive unless they want you to draw infinite cards, basically. There may be games where you even have to be careful to not deck yourself if this survives for long enough, but it's a very strong card anyway. Witch of the Moors is a really nice grindy value engine, the kind of stuff that I really enjoy. So your opponents are going to be sacrificing creatures, and you're going to get to return a creature from the graveyard to your hand. Those are all great things to be doing. And finally, for creatures, we have Wormcoil Engine. This is just a generically good card. Death Touch and Lifelink on a 6/6 body are excellent, but more importantly, it's almost always going to provide us with 2 instances of life-linking creatures, which means that it's very good for carrying the counters from Willowdusk. Next up, we're moving on to sorceries. Agadeem's Awakening is obviously very good in this deck because if we play it as a land, we're paying life, and if we don't, we get a nice late-game spell. Ashes to Ashes is a nice removal spell that's going to kill 2 non-artifact creatures and deal 5 damage to us, which are both things that we're very interested in. Essence Pulse is going to be a very decent board wipe in this deck, and since we have so many counters on some of our creatures, they might actually survive this board wipe, so it can be almost one-sided, which is great. Speeder Swarm is going to cost us some life to play, which is excellent. Healing Technique is going to work super well in this deck because we're going to get to copy it and do it twice. We can just pick someone who doesn't have anything important in their graveyard, and since it's gaining us life twice, we might be gaining upwards of 10 life with this, which can work really well with all of our life gain effects. Night's Whisper is a nice card draw that's going to cost us a bit of life. Reanimate is the best reanimate spell in Commander, which also costs us life. Sign in Blood is similar to Night's Whisper, except you can actually target your opponents occasionally for the lol. Toxic Deluge is another board wiper we have to pay life. It's a very good one. And Turn Timber Symbiosis is similar to Agadeem's Awakening in that both sides are great in this deck. Next up, we're moving on to instants. We have Dismember, which we can pay for super cheap as long as we pay some life. Infernal Grasp is going to be unconditional removal at the cost of 2 life. Malakir Rebirth is always good, but in this deck it's even better because it's costing us 2 life to play it. Momentous Fall can sacrifice one of our huge creatures carrying a bunch of counters at instant speed, and we're going to gain a ton of life and draw a bunch of cards with it, which is really, really good. Pulse of Marasa is going to give us a little bit of recursion for some of our important creatures, and then it's also going to gain us 6 life. Reckless Bite is basically another version of Ashes to Ashes with a slightly different condition. Slaughter is good when we have a bunch of mana mid-game. Early game it's a little bit expensive, but being able to recur this by paying life is really, really good. And Tamiyo's Safekeeping is really good protection for one of our creatures, probably our commander most of the time, which is the one that's going to try to be removed the most, I think. It also happens to gain us 2 life, so it's excellent. Next up we have Enchantments, and we have Exquisite Blood, which can be a combo piece, but in this deck we're not running it as the combo piece, we're just running it for the pure value of gaining a bunch of life. Font of Agonies is going to get counters left and right in this deck, which means that we can use it for really good repeatable removal. Breed is one of the best ways to draw cards, and it's costing us 2 life a pop. Necropotence is probably the best way to draw cards in Commander, and it's going to cost us 1 life every time we do so, which is excellent. Phyrexian Reclamation is a little bit more recursion. We need quite a bit of that in this deck, and this is going to cost us 2 life every time we do it. Sylvan Library is excellent card selection, and it can actually be card draw at the cost of 4 life, but we don't really care about that in this deck, so it's great. An Unspeakable Symbol is a nice little card that works particularly well with all the lifelink we've got going on in the deck, so we can just pay 3 life as many times as we want to put a counter on a creature each time, and then since we've paid all that life, we can then use Willowdusk, so we're actually going to get a bunch of counters out of this, and then we should immediately be able to lifelink back the life loss, which is great. For artifacts, we've got Alamoret's Archive, which is going to allow us to double up on all of those card draw and life gain effects. We've got a lot of that in this deck. Bolas's Citadel is going to give us some more card advantage whilst costing us life. Lightning Grease is there to protect our commander and allow us to use its ability immediately. Mask of Grizzlebrand fits this deck perfectly because it's going to give evasion and lifelink to a creature, and then when that creature dies, we can pay a bunch of life and draw a bunch of cards. This just does everything we could possibly want in this deck. Finally, we have another great new addition, which is Staff of Completion. This works super well in this deck. All of the modes are relevant, even the first one, because it allows us to stop stuff from getting stolen. If somebody steals one of our really big lifelinking creatures, that can be a problem. We can just kill it in response with this. So it just does basically everything in this deck. And finally, we have Vraska Betrayal's Sting. So she's here for a few reasons. She's going to cost us a life every time we use her ability. She also has Phyrexian mana in the cost, which means we can pay life to cast her. And then she proliferates, which is great with our theme of counters. And it's also just good removal. It's basically a very good card overall. And finally, we're moving on to our lands. We're starting off with Cabo Pit, but before that I should mention that obviously you should include any land that you think is good that is going to cost you life or gain you life. There's quite a few that I didn't include because I don't necessarily own them, or I don't want to put too much life gain or life loss in the deck, but feel free to modify this list and add some more. Anyway, Cabal Pit is great because it's going to deal 1 damage to us every time we use it, and then late game it can actually be removal, which is solid. Castle Lothwin should usually come in untapped. It's going to tap for a black, which is fine, and then we can use it to draw cards and lose life late game. City of Brass is going to cost us a life every time we use it. Hall of the Bandit Lord works very well because it's going to cost us a life when we use it, but it can also give our lifelinking creatures haste, and it can also give our commander haste when we recast it, so it's very, very good. Hashep Oasis is going to cost us 1 life every time we use it for mana, and then since we have a few deserts in the deck, we can occasionally use its ability, but mostly it's there just to cost us 1 life. High Market allows us to protect our big creatures from getting stolen, and it's also going to gain us a tiny little bit of life in the meantime. It also works very well with the pests from Beledros with the bloom. Ifnir Deadlands is going to cost us 1 life to use every time, and then we can also use it for removal late game by sacrificing deserts, which is not irrelevant. Radiant Fountain is going to gain us 2 life when it comes in. Scavenger Grounds is going to be better than usual in this deck because we're running a few deserts. And War Room is always great, but when it's costing us 2 life every time, it's even better in this deck. So there you have it. This has been our Willowdusk Essence Seer deck. What do you think? Are there any things you would change? Any additions that you think I missed? Please let me know in the comments section below. I read all comments and respond to all of them too. And if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to click like or subscribe. It really helps the channel. And until next time, take care. Woo!